Garcinda de Sousa was a highly regarded member of the local community in Rio in the 1960s. Along with her husband, she was seen as part of high society, a respected, serious woman who wasn't prone to flights of fancy. It's for this reason that her claims, despite being just one of the many that came into police in Brazil at the time, held a little more weight. She called the police station to claim that on the evening of August 17th, 1966, she had been driving on a road close to Vintem Hill with her 3 children, when she saw something that made her pull her car to the side of the road. In the distance, just above the hill, she could see a bright light. She described it as an oval-shaped object, with a band of fire around its edges, sending rays of light in all directions. What's more, the movement was odd. It seemed to rise up into the sky before falling back down towards the top of the hill. It repeated this movement over and over, as she watched for nearly 4 minutes, before deciding to rush back home and tell her husband. Her husband immediately jumped into the car himself and drove back to the same stretch of road. But Vintem Hill was quiet and dark now. There was no sign of any glowing light, but unbeknownst to him, while the light was gone, Vintem Hill wasn't abandoned. There were 2 men up there. Despite her high standing adding some weight to the story, Miss de Sousa's story likely wouldn't have caught the attention of the press. After all, she was just one of many people in Brazil who claimed to see something unusual flying around in the sky at night at this time. While she did contact the police about it later, apparently many of the details of her encounter were kept secret from the public. But something was discovered just a few days later that made it clear that this was not your standard UFO sighting. A young boy was hiking up the hill on August 20th. What he was doing up in the hills that day seems to be up for debate. Some say he was flying a kite, others that he was hunting birds. But the sun was getting low, and he was in a place that few dared to venture to after dark. It was as the sun was starting to drop behind the horizon that the boy noticed something unusual among the thick bush near a rocky outcrop. At first he thought it was just a pile of discarded clothes, but then he got a clearer look. They were pale forms, laying side by side in the grass. He then thought they must be mannequins, which creeped him out a little. Why was someone leaving mannequins just laying out here, in the middle of nowhere? But as he moved closer, the truth came into focus. 2 men lay on the hillside, dressed in matching formal suits, neat grey raincoats. With them were 2 strange lead masks, designed to just cover the eyes. Each man lay on his back, and they looked almost peaceful. Beside them was an assortment of curious objects, the details of which seemed to differ slightly from source to source, but it is generally accepted that there was an empty bottle of water, a packet of wet towels, and a small notebook containing a cryptic note written in Portuguese. 1630, be at the specified location. 1830, ingest capsules. After effect, protect metals. Await signal. Mask. There were no signs of a struggle, no weapons, no visible injuries. Even the wildlife hadn't begun to pick at the bodies. And most curiously, there was no indication of what had killed them. The boy rushed back down the hill as fast as he could to get the police. He couldn't wrap his head around what he had discovered. What he saw that day would become one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in Brazil's history. Good evening. This is a case a few people have requested quite a while ago now. I initially gave it a cursory glance and thought it was simply an unsolved murder case, much like the Isdale woman story I featured a while back, so I kind of dismissed it a little. But then I recently heard the full story and I was blown away by just how weird this one gets. It's part murder mystery, part UFO encounter, and part paranormal, which feels like the perfect blend for an episode of the Tape Library. Just as a note before we get into this one, this is a very difficult story to really plot out a definitive true accounting of events for. Most modern retellings of this case come from 6 sources, and many of those sources come at this case with a slight bias because of their specific interest, but we can talk about that in a bit more depth later. For the most part, the major details are consistent in most reports of this case, but there are numerous small details that appear in some and not others. I will try my best to provide a comprehensive retelling of the events with the information we have, but a definitive version does not exist. So please keep in mind that this is a story that has been passed through many different hands before reaching us. It is complicated, confusing, and likely can only be told while tying pieces of string to a giant board of newspaper clippings. I'm also terrible at pronouncing names and places. I do try my best, but if I completely butcher the Portuguese language here, please forgive me. This genuinely is a fascinating story, and one that is well worth telling if you aren't already familiar with it. So with that out of the way, get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. This is the strange mystery of the Vintem Hill incident. Welcome to the Tape Library. This story has a lot of different threads that we can pull at, but let's begin with the aftermath of the discovery. Despite the young man's discovery of the 2 bodies, the police were not actually able to get to the bodies until the following day, citing the treacherous conditions of the hill in the dark. When police arrived the next day, they began documenting the scene, and quickly realised these were no ordinary deaths. The men's lead masks appear to have been hand-cut from thin sheets of metal, crudely shaped to fit over their eyes, with no holes for seeing through, and no arms to keep them on their heads, suggesting they were just to be held up for a brief moment. Initially, speculation was that these masks were used to block some kind of radiation, but if that was the case, why were they only shielding their eyes? Others were more unnerved by the masks. They thought it looked almost ritualistic, as though the masks had a symbolic or ceremonial purpose. The initial investigation was messy from the very start. Due to the decomposing that had already begun, it appeared the bodies had been there for at least a few days. The police didn't head to the crime scene for hours after the alarm was raised, and some reports claim that the crime scene had already been disturbed by locals, who had heard what was going on before the police managed to make it there. But both bodies showed no outward signs of any form of violent incident. The case got off to an even worse start when, despite the notes referencing the apparent taking of some kind of substance, the coroner did not perform any investigations on the bodies for a considerable amount of time, claiming they were too busy to do so. When the bodies were eventually studied, the internal organs had all been left for so long that no toxicology report could be conducted, meaning what the 2 men had ingested was unknown. In one report, it is noted that the police chief by the name of Bittencourt handled the belongings the men had. Straight away after doing so, he appeared to fall ill, and his skin erupted in some kind of strange rash. He wasn't seriously affected, but it added further to the air of mystery surrounding the discovery. The bodies were identified as 32-year-old Manoel Pereira de Cruz and 34-year-old Miguel José Viana, 2 electric technicians from the town of Campos dos Goitacazes, about 175 miles to the north. Both men were in their 30s, both well liked and intelligent, with no known enemies. But what had brought them here to this remote hill outside Rio, wearing suits and carrying lead masks? And why had they died side by side with no clear cause, as if waiting for something that never came? Before their deaths became a front-page mystery, Manoel and Miguel were simply 2 working men from a quiet city in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Both were electronics technicians, skilled repairmen who worked with radios and televisions, at a time when Brazil was modernizing rapidly. This was both their livelihood and their fascination. They were described by friends and family as intelligent, hard-working, and deeply curious men. But with that curiosity came something else. A shared interest in the paranormal, particularly in spiritualism and scientific mysticism. The paranormal aspect of their story seems to have all come about after the discovery of a book on spiritism in the back garden workshop of one of the men. In the Brazil of the 1960s, spiritism, a belief system inspired by the writings of French writer Allan Kardec, had become widespread. It blended elements of Christianity with the idea that communication with the dead and beings from other planes was possible through disciplined, scientific-like study. Many technicians, engineers, and educated people were drawn to it because it seemed to merge faith with reason. Around this time, spiritism was everywhere in Brazilian middle-class culture. There were spiritist study groups, bookstores, and centres in almost every major city. They were part church, part laboratory, spaces where prayer and study and scientific curiosity coexisted. Participants didn't see themselves as mystics. They were experimenters. Some even incorporated electronics like radios and tape recorders in an attempt to detect spiritual presence, much like many ghost hunters still do today. Interestingly, while the belief initially focused on more elements like seances and mediumship to contact spirits, as the 20th century progressed, more and more elements of high strangeness and ufology seemed to become wrapped up in the beliefs of some segments of spiritists. Even to this day, spiritism is still the third largest religion in Brazil, and this blending of science and faith was particularly interesting to engineers like Manoel and Miguel, and this discovery of their beliefs seemed to push some reporters to speculate that what they were doing that night was some kind of ritual, but for what purpose? Well, while the police were unable to definitively decide on a cause of death, numerous witnesses did come forward to paint a picture of what the last days of Manoel and Miguel looked like, and they were unusual. In the days before their deaths, both men seemed distracted and secretive. Before leaving town, it's claimed that they stopped at a local bar and chatted with friends. One of them mentioned they were going on a mission that they couldn't talk about, something others had mentioned and bringing up in the weeks prior. Another remembered that Miguel especially seemed anxious, as if he wasn't sure that he'd be back. On August 17th, 1966, they told their families they needed to travel to Rio de Janeiro to purchase materials for their work, with some claiming that they also spoke about buying a second-hand car. Manuel's wife later said he promised to return the next day. They packed cash and a notebook. The cash they took is another detail that varies depending on reports, but this detail is a little more important than most of the contested points. One report claims that they had a little over 1,000 American dollars in today's money, obviously in their local currency, but others have put that number at over 10,000, a huge sum of money to have been carrying around at the time. Some reports state that in their notebook was also a list of numbers and letters that seemed to correspond with electronic components. The two men purchased a bus ticket to Niterói, a city some 15 miles away from their final destination of Vintem Hill. Upon arriving, they purchased 2 raincoats, clearly anticipating they would be outside a lot on this day. Then they stopped at a bar to buy a single bottle of water. The water was provided in a glass bottle. You would keep your receipt and then return the bottle once you had drunk the water. The two men, interestingly, kept the receipt. It was found on one of their bodies, indicating that perhaps they planned to return the bottle later. The person who served them at the bar reportedly later told police that the men seemed nervous, looking around and constantly glancing at their watches. It was clear they were in a hurry. Now again, this is where the story becomes a little muddy. Officially, it seems at the time at least, police were never able to identify any other eyewitnesses that saw the men between buying the water on the 17th and their bodies being discovered a couple of days later. But some English language articles published later seem to add some additional details that maybe flesh out this final day, the most famous of which came from the editor of the journal Flying Saucer Review, Charles Bowen, in 1967, which he seemingly sourced from a number of translated news articles from the time. According to his timeline, the pair had left their hometown on a bus at 9 AM, arriving in Niterioi at 2 PM. He states that it actually was raining that day, hence the purchase of the raincoats. The pair then purchased a bottle of water before leaving the bar at 3:15 PM. They were then spotted around the Vintem Hill area around 5 PM, apparently being driven in a jeep by two men who have never been identified, which Bowen believes would have not left them any time to really go and purchase the electrical components or the car they had apparently set out to purchase. Was this detail simply a cover story for their movements on that day? The driver of the jeep was later described as a blonde man who was said to be foreign looking. In one of the Flying Saucer Review follow-up articles, it is suggested that this man was spotted talking to Manoel and Miguel on the 19th as well, 2 days after the most widely speculated time of their death. But if this was just a mistake or not seems unclear. Another interesting detail included in Bowen's research into the case is that when the boy found the bodies, that wasn't the first time he had seen Manoel and Miguel. He had apparently seen them arriving at the hill on the 17th. Curious to try and figure out what these two suspicious men were up to, the boy went back to the hill the following day. He said he saw them laying in the grass on that day, but thought they were just sleeping. It was only when he returned on the 20th that he apparently smelt the bodies and realised something was wrong. Bowen also provides some additional information about the discovery of the bodies. Both still had money on them, although considerably less than what they were said to have set out with. Also, in their notebook, it seemed to suggest that whatever they had ingested, they had actually been taking prior to the day they arrived on the hill. The notebook saying they should take 1 capsule after lunch on Sunday, 1 capsule at bedtime on Wednesday. They would then need to be at the agreed location, presumably Vintem Hill, at 4:30 PM. They should take the capsules again at 6:30 PM, and then await some sort of signal after protecting their eyes with the masks. Interestingly, it appears that these notes were not written in Manoel or Miguel's handwriting, suggesting they were instructions someone had gave them. Bowen then talks about the UFO sightings that took place on the same night the two men apparently arrived on the hill, although he was not the first one to do so. Another UFO group from Arizona had picked up on the story the year prior and discussed the UFO connections to the mysteries. Their sources, though, apparently stated that the bodies were not discovered by a boy at all, but that the police were already on the hill after receiving multiple calls over the last few days of people seeing an egg-shaped flying object that seemed to land on Vintem Hill. Through his research into the newspaper reports at the time, Bowen also identifies a third man who seems integral to the case, named Eliseo Gomez, who was described by one of the men's widows as their assistant. Gomez was interviewed at length by the police due to an apparent falling out he had had with the deceased men, but he was quickly cleared as being a suspect in their deaths. Gomez gave a little more insight into the spiritual beliefs of the men, and in some ways this just created more questions than it did answers. He said they were scientific spiritualists, as were many of the electronic technicians in the area. But Gomez said that while Miguel and Manoel had an interest in Spiritism, they were not strictly members of the religion. Instead, he claimed they were involved in some kind of secret society, but he claims he doesn't know what the intentions of that society was. But he did say they had a very specific interest in attempting to communicate with life on other planets. Gomez said the two men had gotten him involved in a number of strange experiments. Often he wouldn't really understand what they were doing, simply being on hand to provide assistance. It seemed Miguel and Manoel were rather secretive, even around their close friends and family. One such experiment involved some sort of device in Manoel's back garden that exploded, and seemingly explosions were not an unusual element to their activities. Across the summer of 1966, It was noted the men were reading books on Spiritism and were apparently making specific notes on sections that referred to masks, intense luminosity, and accompanying spirits. Gomez also revealed another contested story that apparently happened back in June of 1966. The three men had travelled to Atafona Beach, around 25 miles from their home, a fact that is backed up by Miguel's sister, who said he had told her just a couple of days before that they would soon be carrying out an important mission, but that it was a secret he could not disclose, something he also said just before leaving for their final trip that led to their deaths, suggesting that this June trip was connected. Once there, Gomez claims that a bright glowing object floated down from the sky and landed on the beach, where it remained for 5 minutes. After this time had passed, the object began to ascend back into the sky, but as it did, it suddenly exploded, the debris falling into the sea. The explosion was apparently so vicious that it shook the windows in the nearby town. This story was somewhat backed up by local fishermen in the area, who also reported seeing a glowing object flying in the sky. It seems unclear if this was a freak accident, or if the two men had done something to make the object explode. But some people began to connect the dots. The explosion in the backyard, the explosion on the beach. They believed that these weren't attempts to contact some form of alien race. Instead, the men had been creating bombs. To say Brazil at this time was facing some political unrest was an understatement. Just 2 years prior, the president had been overthrown in a coup, supported by several groups including the US government, seen as a way to quell what they saw as a growing threat of communism in the country. After the coup, many of the groups that supported communism, or at least left-leaning ideologies, were forced to go underground, something that some have speculated, due to their spiritual beliefs, that Manoel and Miguel may have been sympathetic towards, which has led to speculation that they were in fact creating bombs for rebel forces, or at the very least involved in smuggling electronic parts to make such devices. One reported version of the events even makes reference to there being a newspaper found at the site of their deaths that had been left open on a story about smuggling, but that one just feels too on the nose to be real, a little too clean for this story. But still, it seems on the final day of their lives, it is clear they were supposed to be at Vintem Hill at a specific time. They had a large quantity of cash, and the numbers for numerous electronic devices. They were also apparently spotted with someone who did not appear to be Brazilian, which feels like it could tie into the idea that they were there to make some sort of secretive deal. Maybe the confusing narratives that have come about after their deaths have in part been created by friends, family and colleagues, twisting events to try and protect the reputation of the two men. While certainly a possibility, there is no real concrete evidence to suggest this is the case. While it does explain some elements of the story, it still leaves a lot of unanswered questions. No one still had any idea what had happened to the two men. How had they died? Why were they on the hill that night? Why did they bring along such strange items? The case remained cold. That was until 3 years later, when an inmate at a local prison came forward with a story that he had been involved in the deaths of Manoel and Miguel. But of course, as with any element of this story, his claims were not straightforward, and seemingly it all started with a seance. In 1969, a newspaper ran the confession of an inmate named Hamilton Bazani, who was already in prison facing a sentence of 50 years. He apparently confided in a close female friend that he had been involved in the now infamous lead masks case, and she went to the police to report this. According to his story, he was already wanted by the police at the time and was hiding out in Rio de Janeiro when he was approached by 3 men who had a job for him. That day, the 4 criminals travelled to a nearby spiritualist centre where they met Miguel and Manoel. These 2 men were the targets of the criminals. They had been informed by someone involved at the spiritualist centre that these men were carrying a large sum of money and would have been an easy target for a robbery. The 4 criminals joined Miguel and Manoel in performing a seance. What was learned during this attempt to contact the spirit world is seemingly not included in Hamilton's confession, but shortly after, the group drove to Vintem Hill. Hamilton was instructed to wait in the car with the owner of the Spiritualist Centre, a woman named Helena, while the other 3 criminals marched Miguel and Manoel up the hill. They returned sometime later, carrying plenty of cash that they split with Hamilton. When Hamilton asked them what they had done to Miguel and Manoel, he was informed that they were forced to ingest poison at gunpoint, and were then left to die. On paper at least, this feels like a much more grounded conclusion to the case than apparent attempts to contact UFOs or beings from another dimension. Vintem Hill had a reputation after dark for criminal activity, apparently meaning that even the police avoided the area. The idea that these 2 slightly kooky electronic engineers were marched up the hill with the belief that they were going to try to contact aliens or spirits, but instead were just robbed and murdered seemed totally plausible. But so much of Hamilton's confession just didn't seem to match up with the other details of the case. Even his entire involvement seems questionable. Why would these 3 men involve him just to leave him in the car? Why bring along the owner of the Spiritualist Centre? Why poison the men rather than just shooting them if they had guns? Why take most of their money, but not all? It's all possible, but it feels equally as odd as every other element of the story. But despite the papers reporting on his confession, the police seemingly did not take it seriously, with one detective claiming years later that they believed Hamilton was simply involving himself in the case, in the hope of being taken to another prison that was infamously easier to escape from. The case would once again go cold, and in the English-speaking world at least, it feels like it was largely forgotten about until a little over 10 years later, when famed UFO researcher, along with many other accolades, Jacques Vallée, decided to travel to the area himself and try to uncover what really happened. Vallée met up with one of the first investigators from the site, as well as others who claimed to either be witnesses or to know details about what happened. They explained to him that there were some details about how the bodies were discovered that differed from the initial narrative, such as the age of the boy who found them and who raised the alarm, but by and large these don't really change much. There were apparently some differences about the crime scene in Vallée's recounting though. Along with the money, notebooks and lead masks, there was also a crushed piece of aluminized blue and white paper, cellophane soaked in an unknown chemical substance, and a handkerchief with the initials AMS embroidered on it. It was also claimed that the bodies were covered in strange burns, but this seems to contradict the initial reports that the bodies appeared totally unharmed. The detective also told him that the area didn't just have a criminal element. It was also known as a spot for gay men in the area to meet up, which apparently seemed to initially lead the police down the road that the 2 men were in a relationship, and had for some reason decided to end their lives together. But this theory was quickly dismissed after talking to those that knew them. The detective also confirmed that they believed the lead masks had been created in their back garden workshop, and speculated that they would be used to either shield the eyes from a bright light, or some kind of radiation. He also uncovered some more comments that Miguel and Manoel made before leaving, including revealing that the purchasing of the car was just a cover story, and that instead they were attending what was referred to as a final test, to see if they really were believers. Whatever they had planned on their trip to Vintem Hill, the 2 men believed it would give them insight into if there was any truth to the world of spiritualism. Vallée believed that if this case really were an example of people interacting with UFOs, then it seemed to suggest that these interactions were not always friendly. Some speculate that the pair died from radiation poisoning after being targeted by some kind of alien weapon, even claiming that this was done in retaliation to the flying object being blown up on the beach. But Vallée, while open-minded, doesn't seem to really buy into this theory too heavily, and makes note that he does believe it appears that Miguel and Manoel were building bombs. During his trip though, Vallée did speak with another spiritualist group, who claimed to know what had happened to the 2 men. They believed that Miguel and Manoel had made a psychic connection to a race of creatures that lived on Jupiter. All were female, tall, with 4 fingers and vertical mouths. These beings then contacted the spiritual group after the bodies were discovered to claim that they were responsible. But it was an accident. Miguel and Manoel had run towards their UFO that had been sent to take them away, but they had done so before instructed, and approaching the ship before it was ready had killed them. While Vallée seems to not have taken all that too seriously, he did note one odd detail that is seemingly backed up by several other sources. The spot where the bodies were found, 14 years prior to his trip, was stripped of its grass. Nothing seemed to grow in this specific spot anymore. Still with me? The best write-up I found in this case came from Britt Pitrie's book Unsolved Volume 1, which I purchased as a book, but seemingly it is actually a collection of zines on various unsolved mysteries. They have done a fantastic write-up on this topic, taking all of the most often quoted sources and trying to piece it all together. I've used a variety of different sources, but this is the one I kept coming back to double check all the information contained in the articles. One of the best parts of this write-up is a couple of pages where Britt lists the commonly reported elements of the case, and then separates out the elements that seem to only pop up in some retellings. So I'm going to use that to break down what we know so far. It seems these are the details that are pretty concrete. Both men worked in electronics. They were interested in the paranormal and spiritualism. They had a home workshop where they primarily repaired TVs, and did work with Gomez there. Some sort of incident with an explosion did take place on the beach, but the details are blurry. Then we have the day of their deaths. They did travel by bus for 3 hours to reach Rio, telling people that they planned to buy a car and some electronic components. They purchased water and raincoats that day, and both were smartly dressed in business suits. When their bodies were found, they had the lead masks, although if they were on their faces or on the ground next to them is debated. They also had a handwritten itinerary telling them what to do that day, including ingesting some form of capsule. No evidence of any substance they may have taken was found. No evidence of a struggle or violent altercation was discovered. The 2 men died on the 17th of August 1966. The same night, numerous claims of sightings of a UFO over Vintem Hill were made, before the bodies were discovered on the 20th. But there is so much additional information that appears in some reports and not in others that muddies the waters considerably. Were they found by a boy, or by the police responding to a UFO sighting? What else was contained in their notebooks? Reports on this include claims of electrical part numbers, formulas, and even suggestions that they were taking the unknown capsules prior to their trip, as well as claims of coded messages. Were they really transported by a third party in a jeep? It seems unlikely that the 2 men could have gotten from the bar to the top of the hill in the short span of time they apparently had, according to their notes, but the details regarding the jeep and anyone else being with them remain sketchy. All we know for certain is that Miguel and Manoel were up to something that they didn't want people to know about, that someone had told them to come to Vintem Hill on the 17th at a specific time, and if something or someone met them on the hill that night, it appears it took their lives. If that was something otherworldly, or the vicious acts of a person though, well, that's for you to decide. So what really happened? We've already spoken about some of the theories, but let's try and lay them all out here. We'll begin with the more grounded theories. Perhaps the simplest explanation is also the least satisfying. The men may have ingested an unknown chemical substance, expecting a mild hallucinogenic effect, but accidentally poisoned themselves. During the 1960s, Brazil, like many parts of the world, was seeing a gradual influx of new psychoactive drugs. Access to such substances was uneven, and quality control was non-existent. Investigators speculated that the capsules mentioned in the notebook could have contained anything from LSD, stimulants, to homemade sedatives. Without preserved organs, toxicologists could never test for residues. One forensic officer quoted in a Brazilian magazine at the time suggested the capsules may have caused cardiac arrest, brought on by an overdose, or a combination with alcohol or heat exhaustion. The fact that both men died close together in time and position, without struggle or signs of distress, would fit a gradual poisoning or sedation scenario. But the mystery remains why trained technicians would risk ingesting an untested substance, unless of course they genuinely believed it would bring them closer to something transcendent. Or of course they could have been on a wild drug bender, but that seems unlikely given everything else. A minority of investigators considered the possibility of foul play. Perhaps the two men had been tricked or murdered by someone posing as a fellow experimenter. Rumours circulated that they had been involved in an illegal electronics deal, possibly selling surplus radio parts, and that the capsules might have been some kind of cover story, as well as the earlier possibility I mentioned that they were selling parts to create explosives and got mixed up in a bad deal. Were they forced to take the capsules, as previously suggested, or had they been tricked into doing so on their own accord? But police found no evidence of robbery or struggle, and at least some of their money was still on them. There were no injuries suggesting restraint or force. Also, if a killer had poisoned them, there was no clear motive, and no indication of anyone accompanying them up the hill beyond the later discredited claims by a local prisoner. While not impossible, the criminal theory lacks supporting facts. It persists mainly because the alternatives seem so implausible. The first police theory, however, wasn't either of these. They believed the two men had taken their own lives. Perhaps they thought the men had taken capsules, maybe barbiturates or cyanide, as part of a pact linked to some ritual or cult. There was also the idea that we mentioned earlier that the pair were in a relationship together and had decided to end their lives at the same time. But after extensive interviews were conducted with family and colleagues, this seemed to the police to be unlikely. Part of this was due to the apparent conversation they had with Alicia Gomez. According to some reports of what Gomez apparently said, they had believed they could make contact with otherworldly beings, or possibly observe a spiritual manifestation by following a precise set of preparations. He said the lead masks were intended to protect their eyes from powerful light that may accompany such an event. When asked what the capsules mentioned in the notebook could have been, Alicia speculated that they were very likely stimulants or drugs meant to help them concentrate during the experience, but he claimed to not know exactly what kind. Police pressed him on whether the men had intended to kill themselves, but Gomez denied it completely. He insisted the men had expected to return, a fact that was backed up by their family, who said they would reveal what was going on when they returned from their trip. Gomez told police that he had once joined Manoel and Miguel in an experiment involving a bright light in the sky. They had fashioned crude lead masks, identical to those found on the hill, to protect their eyes from the brilliance they expected to witness. On that earlier occasion, nothing happened, but they had not given up. Many believed that the men's final trip was a repeat attempt to contact or observe something, perhaps what they called a spiritual being of great luminosity. They believed they would see something wonderful, Gomez reportedly said. A vision, a light. They were preparing for that. But if Gomez is a reliable witness is unclear, when we also consider that his words could have been lost in translation, reported on from a second or third-hand report, it means we do have to take these supposed quotes with a pinch of salt. That being said, his claims feel like they match the story. The timing, the ingestion, the masks, all deliberate steps in a ceremony of preparation that feels almost like a weird blending of science and the occult. They may have believed that the capsules would sharpen their perception, or act as a sacrament to attune them to the encounter. If so, something went seriously wrong. Whether the capsules were toxic, counterfeit, or simply too strong is unknown. But this theory suggests that Manoel and Miguel died not by malice, but by misguided faith in a spiritual experiment. The spiritualist explanation eventually merged with a second, more sensational one, the UFO connection. By the late 1960s, Brazilian UFO groups had seized on the lead mask case as potential evidence of alien contact. Some pointed to the men's note, especially the phrase, "await signal," as proof that they were expecting a communication from a craft or an extraterrestrial intelligence, a theory that was seemingly backed up by the reported UFO sightings from the same night that were never explained. In this version of events, the lead masks were designed as protection against radiation or blinding light from a landing or encounter. The note's reference to a signal sounded eerily like a planned radio contact or transmission, something that would have resonated with the two electronics technicians. The capsules, something an otherworldly presence had provided them with, as a way to either facilitate their appearance to the two men, or, as some have suggested, to allow them to survive the trip they were about to be taken on. Certain ufologists claimed that the slopes of Vintem Hill had been the site of previous unexplained lights. Brazil itself had been the site of a so-called UFO flap throughout the 1960s, with countless reports being made. So it was very much in the public consciousness in the country at the time. There were also hints of a possible cover-up based on the seeming incompetence on display in the early stages of the investigation, making it seem like to some, the police were deliberately trying to not solve this case at all. In 1967, the case appeared in several UFO magazines, often accompanied by illustrations of glowing discs above the hillside. These retellings leaned heavily on witness rumours of scorched grass, although if that is true seems unclear. While no tangible evidence ever supported the UFO theory, it's the otherworldly theory that has most stuck in regards to this case. Mostly in part though because the reason this case is even really known in English-speaking countries is because of the various UFO publications and investigators who jumped on it after the fact. These are obviously people who are going to view these events through a specific lens. There is also the very likely idea that this is simply a tragic example of what can happen when people genuinely believe in something that just isn't real. A few writers, particularly in later decades, have explored the idea that Manoel and Miguel were caught in a shared delusion or psychotic episode. Their immersion in spiritualism, their technical training, and their fascination with different phenomena could have combined into an obsessive belief system that eventually consumed them. In this interpretation, the notebook instructions represent a ritual logic of two men in a self-reinforcing belief loop. They were convincing each other, reinforcing their shared delusion. When you throw in the possibility that the two men were experimenting with drugs, it makes it all the more possible. They were not insane exactly, just utterly convinced of the reality of their experiment. In that light, their calm demeanour, their careful preparations, and their willingness to die side by side began to make tragic sense. Brazilian newspapers initially treated the case as a crime mystery. Headlines speculated about espionage, radiation experiments, or suicide pacts. But by the end of the decade, it was the spiritual and extraterrestrial interpretations that captured the public imagination. In part, this reflected the time. The 1960s were a period of scientific optimism and spiritual experimentation, when UFO sightings and psychic research felt very much two sides of the same coin. For a pair of electronic technicians dabbling in spiritism, their story feels like a perfect example of that era's blurred line between science and mysticism. Brazilian spiritualist groups were particularly interested in the case, arguing that Manoel and Miguel had been attempting a transcendental projection, a physical and spiritual separation achieved through disciplined ritual. When their bodies were discovered, some believers suggested their spiritual bodies had succeeded, even if their physical ones had not. For the journalists, the imagery was irresistible. Two men in suits and masks lying in the grass, apparently victims of their own attempt to reach the heavens. It might seem ludicrous, but just a few years later, Heaven's Gate was formed in the US, a group that is often seen as one of the most famous examples of a UFO cult in the world, that ultimately led to death and destruction, when 39 of their members all took their own lives in the 90s, all under the belief that they were being taken away somewhere better. But Heaven's Gate was not the only group with beliefs like this. Maybe the case of Manoel and Miguel was simply an early example of something like that happening. What makes the lead mask case so interesting is that no single theory fits perfectly. Each explains part of the puzzle, but not the whole. If it was a spiritual experiment, why the capsules? Why the money? If it was drugs, why the matching suits and masks? If it was foul play, why the absence of any evidence of violence? Why did they still have money on them? Much like their own personal beliefs, the case of the lead masks is one where the spiritual and the scientific seem to intersect, creating a truly unique mystery. There is one final detail I have deliberately left out until now though, something that is only briefly mentioned in one of the articles, and with very little information included, but a detail that is very important nonetheless. Maybe this was just all in the heads of Miguel and Manoel, a misguided belief in UFOs or spiritual connection. Maybe they were simply robbed and left for dead. Maybe they were just on drugs and acting in an erratic and inexplicable manner because of this. But what makes all these ideas a little harder to use to explain this away is the fact that they weren't the only ones. 4 years prior to their death, on top of a hill in Brazil, some 160 miles away from Vintem Hill, police made a discovery. The body of a television technician named Hermes was found laying dead. There was no explanation for what had killed him, but laying on the ground next to him, police discovered something odd: a lead eye mask. That's all for this entry into the tape library. As I said at the start, when I began reading about this one, I thought it was just a simple unsolved murder. I didn't realise how crazy this one would get. Hopefully this hasn't been too complex to follow. The very nature of this one not having a definitive version of how the events have played out makes it very difficult to tell in a cohesive narrative, without having to ignore details and twist the narrative yourself, so hopefully I've done a reasonable job here. It's a story that has likely been muddied over the years by mistranslations, poor initial reporting by the press, as well as very much in later years being viewed through the lens of ufology, which obviously means what we actually know about what happened to these two men is very messy. As such, it feels unlikely that this is a case that will ever truly be solved. But with that being said, what are your theories? Why do you think they were on that hill? And what do you think happened to them? I've done quite a lot of haunted house paranormal stories recently, so it was nice to jump into something a little different with this. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, then please remember to click like or leave me a 5-star rating if you are listening to the podcast. We're getting so close to 400,000 subscribers on YouTube, so if you haven't already, then please do click the subscribe button. If you want to support the show monetarily, you can do that through Patreon and YouTube memberships. We actually have a fun little group chat over on the Patreon page now, so hopefully some more of you can join us in that. Let's give a quick shout out to those Patreon supporters who keep the show running. Our tape library archivist, Yoinkson Away, Imiko Grimm, West Virginia Vegetable Man, Tina S, Thomas Boatwright, The Crimson DM, The Detective, The Bisexual Moon Cult, Stephen Lutman, Shan Harding, Sean Miller, Sandy Lusk, Sarah Boyd, Rosary Sudrobin, Plum Blossom, Pixelina, Pat McShay, Mirashard, Mindy Zabine, Lisa Marie Sheridan, Lady Bet Noir, Juno, Judith Hacker, Joseph Condela, Jolly Jedi, Joe, Jamie Long, G-Raw, Gabrielle, Gina Britton, Emily Carlin, Eric Salas, Dagon O'Dorleg, Dominic DeAngelis, Dawn Swan, Darla, Crystal Edwards, Aurora, Ashlar's Books, Alfredo Sandoval, and Adeline. Our lead archivist, Xavier Rangel, Win Lewis, Van Yell, Tyler Michael, Tracy Torello, The Original Deer, Sad Girl Callie, Ridiculous, Quirky Joseph, Old Soul Like Mine, Plague Doctor is in, Emmy Bartley, Melissa Harrison, Lord William, London Grace, Brian Baker, Amy Stubblefield, Alex O'Neill, Alex Goldberg, and 1000th Ghost. And our very generous Grand Overseers, Morning Rain 2619, Leah Carmella, Katie, Harrison the Ogre Lord, The God Emperor of Mankind, Bad Diddley, Agent 355, and Queen of Flatulence. And a special shout out to long-time supporter Creepy Candy as well, for just being a good egg. I'm having some issues with the Patreon member names again, so if your shout out was missed or is incorrect, please feel free to drop me a message on there. I've got a really creepy one planned for you all next, so I better get to work on that. Plus a new episode of my second show, Night Drive Paranormal, will be coming along soon. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.